Shalom, friends. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. Hope everyone is doing wonderful. Excited to learn some Torah with you today. As always, feel free to open up your Sefer HaChinuch as we continue learning the various mitzvot of the Taryag mitzvot, the 613 biblical mitzvot. And what we're going to look at today is mitzvah 523. There are many issues around punishment and around witnesses which play out in Jewish law. And the one we're going to look at today is Shelo Lachtof Hadin Al Pi Eid Echad, which means not to pass judgment on the word of one witness. Can't rely on one witness. Where do we learn this? From Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. It says over here in Devarim, Lo yakum eid echad beish lechol avon ulechol chatat, that one witness shall not prevail against a person for any crime or for any sin. So very explicit. Okay, and the Chinuch says, don't just think this is just some shmo up the street, but any one person, whether it's a sage or whether it's a prophet, it's someone who is of highest caliber of honesty and wisdom, still we don't rely on one. And the Chinuch here says, at the root of this, Mishar Sheh HaMitzvah, lies the reason that since the inclination of a person's heart is evil, sometimes a resentful grievance will arise in their heart against their fellow, then even if a person is of the ultimate worthiness, they will not be saved from such a sin at times. So we can't punish someone, incriminate someone because of one person, because all can fail and be unreliable in their testimony, the Chinuch says. Now, of course, we do have an exception to this idea. If you look in the Talmud in Gittin 2b, we learn Eid Echad Ne'eman Be'isurin, that one witness is relied on in prohibitions. This is things like kashrut. So if one person tells you something is kosher and they can be relied upon, then Eid Echad Ne'eman Be'isurin, that we rely on one witness. But here we're dealing with punishment as it comes to criminal justice, and even not only in capital crimes, but also in civil crimes, that for there to be a punishment, we need to know that there will be more than one witness to rely on here. Now, the Chinuch continues that at times a defendant will pay money on the word of one witness, and there's various complexities here. Now, where this moves us is into the concept of Ein Adam Mשים עצמו Rasha, that a person cannot make themselves guilty. And here we move into the topic of torture. So why is this relevant? That Jewish law rejects self-incrimination. Self-incrimination. So in America, self-incrimination can be accepted. In Jewish law, it is of no value. The case is thrown out in a case of self-incrimination. So what does this mean? Ein Adam Mשים עצמו Rasha. That we learn this from the Talmud, Sanhedrin 9b, that no one can call themselves a wrongdoer. No one can hold themselves accountable in this self-incrimination fashion. That a wrongdoer essentially is incompetent, unreliable as an aid, as a witness, because they are presumed to be untruthful and unjust, as we learn from Shmot 23:1, and that some people might also admit to misconduct in order to disqualify themselves from testifying, and because of this, we want to make sure that all witnesses are deemed as such are deemed incompetent. Look at Sanhedrin 25a and Bava Kama 72b. That no one is competent, we learn in Ketubot 27a, to testify in their own favor, either, or against themselves. This is clearly a Talmudic ruling, because many bring up the issues that come up throughout Tanakh, such as in the book of Samuel, chapters 1 and chapter 14, in the book of Joshua, chapter 7. And the Chazal, the Talmudic rabbis, try to explain away those stories, either that the confessions happening in those biblical stories are happening after trial or even after a conviction, or they're saying that they are merely expiating themselves from the sin before God, as opposed to dealing with the trial itself. Look at Sanhedrin 43b. Or also that these are exceptions to the general rule. This is a hora'at sha'ah, that it's an exception to the general law. So here we see that these confessions are not only inadmissible in regards to capital crimes, but also in these cases that might deal with flogging or with fines. Look at Rashi, Yevamot 25b, or even as smaller types of punishments themselves. Rambam goes further here and says that we can't receive a witness against oneself, also because there may be depressed people. Depressed people who have not committed a crime and yet turn themselves in or confess to something they themselves did not do. Look at the Mishnah Torah on Sanhedrin 18:6. We also know that this may be very unreliable information for various reasons. And some have argued that the court themselves has to do their own fact-finding process and can't rely on or even pressure such a person on trial. So for their life or for even smaller things. So here we get to the issue of torture. So one of the reasons that some justify torture is that this person has reliable information about themselves or about others. So we see here that once they are implicated, they themselves cannot be a witness in such a case. And thus torture is itself a futile effort because we are trying to extract information which is legally invalid information. Right? It is not only invalid that we know from various studies that information, confessions drawn out through torture is remarkably unreliable. And so some argue that all is fair in love and war, right? In love and in war, everything is fairly justifiable. In fact, Rabbi Michael Broyd in Atlanta said, war is basically concerned with the ethical suspension of the general suspension of our ethical sensibilities. That essentially all rules are off. But I think we could argue that based on biblical laws and various Talmudic laws, that this is not the case. While a case could be made there on some grounds, we know in the Torah that we can't destroy trees of our enemies in a time of war. We also learn of how female captives need to be treated. For the first, look at Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 19 to 20. For the second, look at Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 14. And there's various other cases. Much has been written about Jewish ethics of war. This is very important to remember, that in fact, according to Jewish values, not everything is permitted in times of war. In addition to that, as mentioned, torture may in fact be useless. Based on ein adam mשים עצמו Russia, self-incriminatory evidence being worthless, that's also the point. And based upon this data, that the information that is derived is generally unreliable for various reasons, that one is either in a state of trauma, or that under pressure, one gives any information they can to get out of torture, various reasons why it's unreliable. And we're also should be concerned that if torture is permitted in some cases, that it will be used in many other cases where it will be unjustifiable. And according to Kant and to Rawls, we should ask ourselves, is it ever fair that I am tortured? And if we say it's never fair that I am tortured by an enemy, then we should not allow torture of an enemy on our end as well. We could also argue that it is a chilul Hashem for Jewish law to allow torture, that while it's true, the lowest common denominator in the ethics of warfare, or just the case of warfare in general, is that torture is done in times of war, and in prisons and in courts and all types of things around the world, that the role of the Torah is to be an or lagoyim, to be a light of a higher ethical standard. So just because it's the norms of warfare does not mean we need to sink down to that level. And so, lastly, I think we can argue, based upon the notions of kavod habriyot, the notions of kavod habriot, human dignity, that there are dimensions of the human spirit that cannot be broken. That our social dignity can be lost, one can be imprisoned or taken to court, but that our deep human dignity can, even if one has committed crimes, cannot be violated. And torture would be a violation of one's deepest, infinite human dignity. I see my friend AJ wrote a question here. Do the rabbis ever talk about a ticking clock scenario? What is the utilitarian approach of unethically hurting one person if it saves thousands, millions of lives? It's a great question. And Judaism is relatively adamant on a deontological ethic as opposed to merely a consequential or a utilitarian ethic, which is to say that 5 human lives cannot be made more valuable than 1 human life, because every human life has infinite validity. And so we cannot destroy 1 life for the sake of many others. In fact, we have to pay a lot of money to rescue a captive because of the value of that 1 life. And so there's a lot to say about that issue, about that general moral debate of saving many lives versus 1. But we've also learned that the ticking clock case is an absurd scenario because very rarely do we find this to be the case. It's sort of used up by those who want to argue to justify torture, but in fact, the ticking time clock, the ticking clock case is rarely true, and rarely do we have the right person who has the right information in that right moment. Where that case actually works. Now let's look at the Geneva Convention, because this is part of the global discourse that's happening. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which is commonly known as the United Nations Convention Against Torture, UNCAT, is an international human rights treaty under the review of the UN that aims to prevent torture and other acts of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment around the world. The convention requires states to take effective measures to prevent torture in any territory under their jurisdiction and forbids states to transport people to any country where there is reason to believe they will be tortured. The text of the convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 10th of 1984. And following ratification by the 20th State Party, it came into force on June 26 of 1987. And is now recognized, June 26 is now recognized as the International Day in support of victims of torture in honor of the convention. Since the convention's entry into force, the absolute prohibition against torture and other acts of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment has become accepted as a principle of customary international law. Now, of course, countries will engage in this anyways. The UN is not really able to enforce this fully. But nonetheless, this is about creating a global standard against the use of torture against one's enemies or against one's own citizens. Now, how is torture defined under this Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment? Here's what it says here in Article 1.1. For the purpose of this convention, the term torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or suspecting of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by, or at the instigation of, or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. It does not include pain or suffering arising only from inherent in or incidental to lawful sanctions. Okay, so here we looked at Mitzvah 523, which deals with the fact that one witness cannot be relied upon in general, and also that we don't deal as valid self-incriminatory evidence. And this extends us into the conversation of torture, that one of the reasons given for torture is to extract information. And here we see why this would be invalid. Among other reasons why we should be opposed to torture based on Jewish values, based upon Jewish ethics of war, based upon the fact of this unreliable testimony based upon the factor of Chilul Hashem, that Jewish values should elevate the global discourse rather than lower it, based on the fact of empathy, that we would never ourselves want to be tortured or have anyone we love or care about be tortured, or one of our citizens, and so we should build global norms that are true for the other side as well, and lastly, that kavod habriyot, that human dignity means there is certain treatment even for those who have done or are suspected of having done horrible things, means there are certain protections for every human being who should never be tortured. I would extend that solitary confinement should be treated as a form of torture, based upon what we know about what it does to the mind and certainly to the body as well, and to the human spirit. And also going beyond humans, that we should not torture animals. There may be a few exceptions where animal testing may be permitted in order to find life-saving cures for human beings and for other animals. But bracketing that, dealing with cosmetics or certainly with the food consumption, we should not have any form of torture. So I look forward to our continued learning together. Have a wonderful day.